March 27, 1942, 0130 hours, Saint-Nazaire, occupied France. The explosion that followed would be heard 15 kilometers away, but in this moment complete silence hung over the destroyer HMS Campbelltown as it raced toward the massive Normandy dock gates at 18 knots. Captain Lieutenant Friedrich Karl Christiansen watched from his coastal defense position as what appeared to be a German torpedo boat approached flying Kriegsmarine flags. Something felt wrong. German ships didn't approach at such reckless speed. They didn't ignore challenge signals. They didn't maintain radio silence. By the time Christiansen realized his mistake, it was too late. The Campbelltown, her bow packed with 4 1/4 tons of high explosives disguised as a destroyer on delayed fuses, rammed into the dock gates at full speed. From her deck poured not German sailors, but British Commandos, who began systematically destroying everything in sight with a violence and precision that would haunt German coastal defenders for the rest of the war. In the chaos that followed, as demolition teams blew pumping stations, winding houses, and dock machinery with textbook efficiency, Christiansen would witness something that contradicted everything Wehrmacht intelligence had told him about British fighting capability. These weren't the gentlemanly soldiers of 1940 who had evacuated from Dunkirk. These were something entirely different, something terrifying. 12 hours later, as German officers inspected the captured Campbelltown, congratulating themselves on preventing its scuttling, the delayed fuses detonated. The massive explosion killed over 360 German soldiers and French workers, vaporized the dock gates, and ensured that the Tirpitz, Germany's most powerful battleship, would never have a French Atlantic port capable of servicing it. But more significant than the tactical victory was the psychological impact. Wehrmacht commanders along the Atlantic Wall were discovering that Britain had created a new type of soldier, one that struck without warning, fought with unprecedented ferocity, and vanished before conventional forces could respond. The German High Command would issue specific directives about these raiders, special security measures, immediate execution orders, propaganda campaigns to maintain morale among coastal garrisons who now scanned every horizon with dread. Yet curiously, when American forces began arriving in Britain later that year, German intelligence assessments dismissed them as even less capable than the pre-war British Army. Soft, inexperienced, lacking the warrior tradition of European armies. This miscalculation would prove nearly as costly as underestimating the commandos, but the contrast reveals a fascinating truth about how the Wehrmacht evaluated their enemies and why they got it so catastrophically wrong. The story of why Nazis feared British commandos while dismissing American troops is the story of how psychological warfare, tactical innovation, and strategic deception combined to create military mythology that shaped the entire war. It's a story written in blood on the coasts of Norway and France, in the mountains of Italy and Greece, in classified German reports that reveal terror disguised as tactical assessment. The birth of British fury began with catastrophic defeat. After Dunkirk, Britain stood alone with a shattered army, minimal equipment, and no apparent way to strike back at German-occupied Europe. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, recognizing that passive defense would destroy British morale, demanded offensive action regardless of conventional military wisdom. On June 4, 1940, the same day he delivered his famous "We shall fight on the beaches" speech, Churchill sent a memo to General Hastings Ismay that would change warfare forever. We must develop the storm troop idea. Enterprises must be prepared with specially trained troops of the Hunter class who can develop a reign of terror down the enemy coast. The commandos were born from this directive, not as a supplement to conventional forces, but as their antithesis. Where regular infantry trained for set-piece battles, commandos would train for chaos. Where normal units followed established doctrine, commandos would write their own rules. Where traditional soldiers sought to minimize risk, commandos would embrace it. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley Clark, tasked with organizing these new units, established selection criteria that rejected everything the British Army traditionally valued. Physical fitness mattered less than mental toughness. Following orders mattered less than initiative. Military bearing mattered less than lethality. Clark sought men who were, in his words, thoroughly indisciplined in the best sense. The first volunteers came from across the British military. Many were refugees from Dunkirk, burning with desire for revenge. Others were professional soldiers frustrated by conventional warfare's constraints. Some were adventurers drawn to sanctioned mayhem. All shared one characteristic noted in German intelligence reports. They possessed what Wehrmacht psychologists called abnormal aggression indices. Training began at Achnacarry Castle in the Scottish Highlands under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan, an officer whose methods would have triggered immediate investigation in peacetime. Live ammunition was used in all exercises. Casualties during training were accepted as necessary. Men who couldn't keep pace were returned to their units without ceremony. Those who remained emerged transformed. The course lasted 8 weeks and broke most candidates. Physical conditioning reached extremes that regular infantry would have considered impossible. Speed marches covered 50 miles in 24 hours carrying full equipment. Cliff climbing, small boat handling, demolitions, silent killing, close quarters combat, and navigation were all taught to standards that exceeded anything in conventional military training. But the real transformation was psychological. Commandos learned to embrace chaos rather than fear it, to see darkness as an ally rather than a threat, to view overwhelming odds as an opportunity rather than a reason to surrender. German interrogators would later note that captured commandos displayed fanatic determination inconsistent with British national character. The weapons training diverged radically from standard British Army practice, where regular infantry trained for volley fire and disciplined engagements. Commandos learned instinctive shooting. They practiced firing while running, falling, rolling. They trained in complete darkness until they could field strip and reassemble weapons by touch alone. They learned to kill silently with knife, garrote, or bare hands. Explosives training produced men who could demolish bridges, factories, ships, or fortifications with whatever materials were available. Chemistry became weaponized. Engineering became destructive. Every commando became a walking demolition team capable of reducing German infrastructure to rubble. The Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife became their symbol. Designed by William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes, former Shanghai police officers who had survived hundreds of street fights, the knife was optimized for a single purpose: killing humans as efficiently as possible. Its double-edged blade could penetrate winter uniforms and heavy coats. Its needlepoint could slip between ribs. Its thin profile minimized resistance. Fairbairn himself, 55 years old when the commandos formed, taught close-quarters combat with techniques he developed fighting triad gangs. His methods prioritized lethality over sportsmanship. Eyes, throat, and groin were primary targets. There were no rules, no fair play, no quarter given. German soldiers who survived commando encounters consistently reported being attacked with a violence that seemed personal rather than military. The first commando raids began in June 1940, small probing attacks against the Norwegian coast. These initial operations achieved little material damage, but served crucial purposes. They bloodied the new units under combat conditions. They forced Germany to divert resources to coastal defense. Most importantly, they began building the psychological pressure that would eventually terrorize German garrison troops. Operation Claymore on March 4, 1941, marked the commandos' announcement as a serious threat. 500 men from numbers 3 and 4 commandos landed in the Lofoten Islands, destroying fish oil factories that produced glycerin for German explosives. They sank 11 ships totaling 25,000 tons. They captured 215 German prisoners and recruited 300 Norwegian volunteers. But the operation's most significant achievement was psychological. The raiders demonstrated complete mastery of amphibious assault. They struck with overwhelming speed, accomplished their objectives with professional efficiency, and withdrew before German reinforcements could respond. Wehrmacht commanders reviewing the after-action reports realized they faced a fundamentally different type of enemy. The December 27, 1941 raid on Vaagso escalated the psychological warfare to new levels. 600 commandos from No. 3 Commando, supported by naval gunfire and RF fighters, assaulted this Norwegian coastal town with a violence that stunned German defenders. Brigadier John Durnford Slater, commanding the operation, had given explicit orders: show no mercy. These are not prisoners to be taken politely. These are invaders of Allied territory to be killed. The commandos executed these orders with enthusiasm that German survivors described as berserker fury. House-to-house fighting lasted 6 hours. Commandos used grenades, submachine guns, and knives to clear buildings held by Gebirgsjäger mountain troops, elite soldiers who had conquered Norway. The Germans discovered that their Arctic warfare training meant nothing against enemies who seemed to welcome close combat. Wehrmacht troops who had terrified Polish and French soldiers found themselves terrified. The raid destroyed 15,000 tons of shipping, fish oil factories, ammunition stores, and communications facilities, but its psychological impact far exceeded material damage. German coastal garrisons from Norway to France received emergency reinforcements. Hitler personally ordered that coastal defenses be strengthened. Kriegsmarine officers requested permanent air cover for all coastal installations. Most tellingly, German soldiers captured during the raid exhibited signs of psychological trauma unusual for elite mountain troops. Their interrogation reports noted extreme stress reactions and statements suggesting encounter with irregular forces employing terror tactics. The Wehrmacht was learning that British Commandos weren't merely skilled soldiers. They were psychological weapons designed to induce terror. Before we continue with how the Nazis' fear of these raiders grew into genuine terror, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We bring you these detailed accounts of World War II's most fascinating stories twice a week, revealing the human experiences and strategic decisions that shaped history. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss an episode. The raid that crystallized German fear occurred on March 28, 1942 at Saint-Nazaire. The operation's objectives seemed suicidal: destroy the only dry dock on the Atlantic coast capable of servicing the battleship Tirpitz, eliminating its potential as a surface raider threatening Atlantic convoys. The plan involved ramming an obsolete destroyer packed with explosives into the dock gates, then holding the position while demolition teams destroyed pumping machinery. 611 commandos from No. 2 Commando, led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, loaded onto HMS Campbelltown and 18 motor launches. German intelligence had detected unusual British naval activity, but dismissed the possibility of a major raid. Saint-Nazaire lay 5 miles up the Loire estuary, protected by shore batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and a garrison of 5,000 troops. Conventional military wisdom deemed it impregnable. The Campbelltown flew German flags and responded to challenge signals with captured German codes. By the time coastal defenders realized their mistake, the destroyer had rammed the dock gates at 19.5 knots, embedding its explosive-laden bow deep into the structure. Commandos poured ashore under withering fire. What followed was urban warfare at its most brutal. Demolition teams, each assigned specific targets, fought their way to pumping stations, winding houses, and dock machinery. Sergeant Thomas Durant, commanding a motor launch's guns, continued firing despite being wounded 5 times, buying time for demolition teams to reach their objectives. He would receive a posthumous Victoria Cross, the only one ever awarded based primarily on German eyewitness testimony. The commandos held for 2 hours against overwhelming numbers. They demolished every assigned target despite casualties exceeding 60%. When ammunition ran low, they fought with knives and rifle butts. German troops who had conquered Poland, France, and the Balkans found themselves pushed back by soldiers who seemed indifferent to death. At 0930 hours, with demolitions complete and ammunition exhausted, Neumann ordered surrender. 169 commandos became prisoners. 64 lay dead. 64 motor launch crew had also died. But the mission had succeeded beyond expectations. 12 hours later, senior German officers toured the captured Campbelltown. Kapitänleutnant Friedrich Paul, chief of the Saint-Nazaire port security, was explaining how they had prevented the destroyers scuttling when the delayed fuses detonated. The explosion, equivalent to 3 tons of TNT, vaporized everyone within 400 meters. Paul died instantly, along with over 360 German soldiers and French civilian workers. The dock gates, built to withstand battleship collisions, were destroyed so completely that they wouldn't be repaired before war's end. The Tirpitz never left Norwegian waters, its threat to Atlantic convoys permanently neutralized, but Saint-Nazaire's significance transcended tactical success. Hitler personally drafted the Kommandobefehl, the commando order, in response to raids like Saint-Nazaire. Issued October 18, 1942, it mandated immediate execution of any commando captured, even if in proper uniform. The order stated, "From now on, all terror and sabotage troops of the British and their accomplices, who do not act like soldiers but like bandits, will be treated as such by German troops and will be ruthlessly eliminated in battle wherever they appear." This order, which would result in war crimes trials after the war, revealed the depth of German fear. Nations don't order execution of uniformed enemy soldiers unless those soldiers have achieved psychological effects far beyond their numerical strength. The Kommandobefehl was Adolf Hitler admitting that British commandos terrified German coastal defenders so completely that normal military law had to be suspended. German coastal garrison troops now scanned empty horizons with genuine dread. Every fishing boat might conceal raiders. Every calm night might explode into violence. Intelligence reports couldn't predict where commandos would strike next. Conventional defense proved inadequate against enemies who attacked anywhere, anytime, with fury that shattered morale. Oberleutnant Hans Schmidt, commanding a coastal defense battery near Cherbourg, wrote in his diary in July 1942, "The men fear the commandos more than bombing raids. At least with bombs, you hear them coming. The commandos appear from darkness itself. They are not human soldiers. They are demons." This terror produced measurable effects. German coastal garrisons required triple the normal rotation frequency to maintain morale. Psychiatric casualties among coastal troops exceeded rates in frontline infantry divisions. Desertion rates from Atlantic wall positions were suppressed in official records, but acknowledged in classified communications to Berlin. The Wehrmacht diverted increasingly scarce resources to coastal defense. By late 1942, over 300,000 German troops occupied Atlantic wall positions, the majority stationed there primarily because of commando threat. These soldiers, who might have reinforced the Eastern Front or North African campaigns, instead spent the war defending against raiders who rarely numbered more than a few hundred. While German fear of British commandos intensified through 1941 and 1942, their assessment of American military capability remained dismissive. Wehrmacht intelligence reports from this period reveal consistent underestimation based on fundamental misunderstanding of American society and military culture. A March 1942 intelligence summary from Fremde Heere West, Foreign Armies West, the Wehrmacht's Western Intelligence Directorate, concluded, American forces lack warrior tradition. Officer corps is politically appointed rather than professionally trained. Enlisted ranks show poor discipline and excessive individualism. Combat effectiveness is estimated well below British standards, which are themselves inferior to German forces. This assessment rested on multiple assumptions that seemed logical to German observers but were catastrophically wrong. The Wehrmacht evaluated armies through the lens of European military tradition, where centuries of warfare had created professional military castes and established doctrines. America's relatively brief military history and democratic culture suggested amateurism to German professionals. German officers noted that the United States had a tiny pre-war army, just 190,000 active-duty personnel in 1939. American soldiers were known to question orders, talk casually with officers, and maintain civilian attitudes that seemed incompatible with military effectiveness. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized unquestioning obedience and rigid hierarchy. American informality was interpreted as indiscipline. Nazi racial ideology reinforced these tactical assessments. America's multi-ethnic military seemed weak compared to Germany's racially pure forces. Hitler personally dismissed American combat potential, telling associates in December 1941, "The Americans are a mongrel race, incapable of sustaining warfare against a superior people." These beliefs persisted, despite evidence to the contrary. When American forces first encountered German troops in North Africa in February 1943 at Kasserine Pass, initial defeats seemed to confirm Wehrmacht assumptions. The engagement, where experienced Afrika Korps troops routed untested American infantry, reinforced German confidence. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel reported to Berlin after Kasserine, "American troops show poor tactical awareness and inferior fighting spirit. Officers lack combat experience. With adequate forces, the American threat in North Africa can be eliminated." German propaganda celebrated the victory as proof of Aryan martial superiority over American mediocrity. But German intelligence failed to recognize the fundamental difference between American and European military culture. European armies improved incrementally through institutional knowledge. American forces improved explosively through systematic analysis and rapid adaptation. The Germans who had defeated Americans at Kasserine were about to discover this distinction. Within weeks of Kasserine, American forces had analyzed their failures, retrained their troops, replaced ineffective commanders, and implemented new tactics. By May 1943, when the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia, Wehrmacht officers discovered that the same American units they had routed 3 months earlier now fought with competence that approached British standards. But Americans still lacked the terror factor that commandos had cultivated. German troops respected American firepower and logistics. They acknowledged improving American tactical competence. But they didn't fear Americans the way they feared British raiders appearing from darkness with knives and explosives. This distinction appeared consistently in German military correspondence. A June 1943 report from Tunisia stated, "American forces fight conventionally and can be engaged with standard tactics. British commando forces require special security measures and produce psychological effects disproportionate to their numbers." The contrast reflected different strategic priorities. America focused on building mass armies capable of sustained conventional warfare. Britain, with smaller manpower reserves, invested in elite forces designed for psychological impact and strategic disruption. Both approaches proved effective, but they produced different enemy reactions. American commanders initially dismissed commando-style operations as expensive stunts. General George Marshall questioned whether small raids justified the resources required. American military doctrine emphasized overwhelming force applied systematically, not surgical strikes by elite units. The cultural preference was for democratic armies where every soldier was equally valued, not aristocratic special forces. But combat experience gradually changed American perspectives. In June 1942, the United States Army activated its 1st Ranger Battalion based explicitly on British Commando models. The unit's commander, Major William Darby, trained his men at Achnacarry alongside British Commandos, learning the same brutal methods that had terrorized German coastal defenders. The 1st Ranger Battalion's initial operations revealed both the potential and limitations of importing British methods. During the Dieppe raid on August 19, 1942, 50 Rangers accompanied Canadian and British forces in history's costliest commando operation. The raid, intended to test German defenses and capture intelligence, became a catastrophic defeat with 68% Allied casualties. Dieppe demonstrated that commando tactics required more than training. They demanded the institutional culture, tactical flexibility, and acceptable casualty rates that Britain had developed through desperation. American forces, building mass armies for conventional warfare, struggled to adopt methods designed for elite raiders operating outside normal military constraints. Yet individual Rangers who survived Dieppe returned with profound respect for commando culture. They had witnessed British raiders fighting with suicidal courage despite impossible odds. They had seen commandos continue demolishing objectives while surrounded and outnumbered. They had learned that psychological warfare sometimes mattered more than tactical success. Sergeant Alex Sima, one of 6 Rangers awarded the Silver Star at Dieppe, later recalled, "The British commandos fought like nothing I'd seen. When wounded, they kept fighting. When surrounded, they kept fighting. When ordered to withdraw, they argued for permission to continue attacking. The Germans feared them because they should fear them." This grudging German respect for commandos, while dismissing American forces, continued through 1943. Wehrmacht intelligence distinguished carefully between British elite units and American conventional forces. Coastal garrison standing orders specified different responses. American landings should be contained and repelled through standard defense. British commando raids required immediate reinforcement, maximum firepower, and no attempts at negotiation. The November 1943 raid on the Telemark heavy water plant in Norway demonstrated why Germans had learned to fear commandos. Though executed primarily by Norwegian resistance fighters trained by British Special Operations Executive, the operation embodied commando principles: surgical strike, maximum psychological impact, minimal force. 6 men infiltrated one of the most heavily guarded facilities in occupied Europe, destroyed equipment crucial to German atomic research, and escaped across 250 miles of winter wilderness. The raid's success sent shockwaves through German security services. If 6 men could penetrate seemingly impregnable defenses, no installation was safe. German responses to commando threat reached paranoid levels by 1944. Coastal defenses were reinforced with minefields, beach obstacles, and additional garrison troops. Every village along the Atlantic Wall maintained rapid reaction forces. Hitler personally reviewed security procedures for critical installations monthly. The resource cost was staggering. Divisions that might have opposed Soviet offensives instead defended against raiders who might never come. This strategic success demonstrated commandos' real value. The terror they inspired forced Germany to maintain disproportionate coastal defenses. Every soldier guarding Norwegian fjords or French beaches was a soldier unavailable for the Eastern Front. The psychological warfare had achieved strategic effects far exceeding anything their actual attacks accomplished. By contrast, American forces in 1943 and early 1944 were still building reputation through conventional success. The invasions of Sicily and Italy demonstrated improving American tactical competence. The Salerno landing in September 1943 showed American infantry could conduct complex amphibious operations. The Anzio landing in January 1944 proved American forces could establish and hold contested beachheads. German intelligence reports acknowledged these American improvements while maintaining dismissive tone. A February 1944 assessment noted American forces have achieved basic tactical competence through British instruction and combat experience. They remain inferior to German units of equivalent size, but can achieve local success through material superiority. They do not demonstrate the fanaticism characteristic of British commando forces. This assessment's crucial flaw was assuming that American conventional forces needed to match commando psychological impact. American strategy never prioritized terror tactics. Instead, it focused on industrial warfare, overwhelming enemies with superior logistics, firepower, and systematic application of force. This approach proved devastatingly effective without requiring the psychological elements that made commandos terrifying. The Ranger battalions, however, continued developing along commando lines. By D-Day, 6 Ranger battalions existed, trained in commando methods and employed for missions requiring elite infantry. Their most famous operation, the assault on Pointe du Hoc, on June 6, 1944, finally earned Americans the respect previously reserved for British commandos. 225 Rangers from 2nd and 5th Ranger battalions scaled 100-foot cliffs under direct fire to silence artillery positions threatening Omaha Beach. German defenders, expecting the cliffs to be impassable, found themselves overrun by soldiers using specialized equipment and tactics that seemed impossible. The Rangers held their position for 2 days against overwhelming counterattacks, suffering 135 casualties. Now, before we reveal how German perception of American forces finally changed and examine the ultimate legacy of these elite warriors, make sure you're subscribed to our channel. We publish detailed World War II documentaries like this one twice weekly, bringing you the stories, strategies, and human experiences that shaped history. Click that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into military history. Oberst Rudolf Heine, commanding the German forces that eventually pushed the Rangers off Pointe du Hoc, filed a report that marked a turning point in Wehrmacht assessment of American forces. Enemy troops demonstrated commando-level training and determination. They employed specialized climbing equipment and assault tactics previously associated only with British elite forces. Casualties inflicted were disproportionate to defender advantages. The Normandy invasion marked the convergence of British psychological warfare and American material superiority. While commandos struck Pegasus Bridge and coastal positions with characteristic fury, American forces demonstrated that they had learned from British innovations while maintaining their own strengths. The combination proved unstoppable. German defenders along the Atlantic Wall discovered that British commandos were no longer their only nightmare. American Rangers fought with similar ferocity. American paratroopers showed comparable initiative. Even American conventional infantry, when properly trained and led, displayed aggression that matched German expectations of Allied fighting spirit. The transformation accelerated through the summer and fall of 1944. Darby's Rangers fought through Italy with casualty rates that would have been unsustainable for conventional units. The 1st Special Service Force, a joint American-Canadian unit trained in commando methods, earned the German nickname Devil's Brigade for nocturnal raids that terrorized German positions. But the clearest evidence of changing German perception appeared in the Ardennes Offensive, Hitler's last gamble in December 1944. The operational plan, developed by Wehrmacht staff officers, identified American positions as the primary target specifically because German intelligence now rated American forces as more vulnerable than British units. The assessment proved catastrophically wrong. American troops at Bastogne, the Elsenborn Ridge, and St. Vith fought with a determination that shattered German assumptions. Units surrounded and outnumbered refused surrender. Soldiers with minimal training held positions against elite German forces. The fighting spirit Germans had exclusively attributed to British Commandos appeared throughout American ranks. General Major Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff for German forces in the West, wrote after the war, "We made a fundamental error. We assumed American soldiers lacked the warrior spirit we had encountered in British Commandos. We learned that American conventional forces, when defending their positions or protecting their comrades, fought with comparable determination. Their material superiority made this spirit decisive. This reassessment came too late to affect German strategy. By January 1945, Wehrmacht forces were in full retreat on all fronts. But German military correspondence from the war's final months shows grudging respect for American forces that earlier intelligence had dismissed. The final irony emerged in post-war interrogations. German officers consistently rated British Commandos as the most terrifying enemies they faced, even above Soviet troops. But when asked which Allied forces were most effective overall, they ranked American conventional forces higher. The distinction revealed profound truth. Terror and effectiveness are not identical. British Commandos achieved strategic effects disproportionate to their numbers through psychological warfare. They forced Germany to maintain massive coastal defenses. They demonstrated that no position was secure. They created mythology of British fighting spirit that complicated German morale. Their contribution to Allied victory was undeniable. American forces achieved victory through different means. They built armies that could sustain multi-year campaigns. They developed logistics that made defeat materially impossible. They adapted tactically faster than any military in history. They combined industrial capacity with fighting spirit that, while less theatrical than commando raids, proved equally formidable. The Rangers and other American special forces eventually earned respect equal to British Commandos. By war's end, German intelligence reports treated American Rangers, paratroopers, and conventional infantry with the same wariness previously reserved for British elite units. The dismissive assessments of 1941 had been replaced by acknowledgement that American forces, regardless of type, represented formidable enemies. The legacy of this transformation extends far beyond World War II. The United States military's modern Special Operations Forces descend directly from Ranger battalions that trained with British Commandos. The psychological warfare principles developed by Churchill's Raiders influence contemporary special operations doctrine. The understanding that elite forces can achieve strategic effects through terror remains central to military planning. But perhaps the most important lesson concerns the danger of underestimating enemies based on cultural prejudice. German intelligence in 1941 possessed accurate information about American industrial capacity, manpower reserves, and potential military capability. They dismissed this information because Nazi ideology insisted that democratic, multi-ethnic societies couldn't produce effective warriors. This ideological blindness cost Germany the war as surely as any battlefield defeat. Every soldier diverted to guard against commandos was a soldier unavailable for the Eastern Front. Every month spent underestimating American forces was a month wasted that could have been used preparing more effective defenses. The terror inspired by British Commandos and the eventual recognition of American capability both stemmed from fundamental German failure to assess enemies objectively. The British Commandos who terrified German coastal defenders were products of desperation, innovation, and calculated psychological warfare. They emerged from Britain's darkest hour as instruments of revenge and symbols of defiance. Their raids accomplished tactical objectives, but their true value lay in forcing Germany to fear shadows and guard empty beaches against enemies who might strike anywhere. The American forces, who Germans initially dismissed, proved equally formidable through different means. They built overwhelming material superiority, adapted with unprecedented speed, and fought with determination that shattered assumptions about democratic armies. Their contribution to victory was measured not in terror inspired, but in systematic destruction of enemy forces through industrial warfare. Together, these Allied forces demonstrated that there are multiple paths to military effectiveness: elite raiders employing psychological warfare, conventional armies leveraging industrial capacity, strategic deception, and tactical innovation. The combination proved unstoppable against enemies blinded by ideology and handicapped by underestimating opponents. Oberst Friedrich von Bormann, captured in April 1945 and interviewed extensively about Wehrmacht intelligence failures, provided perhaps the most honest assessment. We were correct that British Commandos represented a unique threat requiring special countermeasures. We were catastrophically wrong in assuming American forces lacked comparable fighting spirit. Our error was believing that because Americans fought differently, they fought less effectively. This mistake cost us the war. The statistics support this conclusion. British Commandos conducted over 400 raids during the war, tying down over 300,000 German troops in coastal defense. American forces, through conventional operations and Ranger actions, destroyed German military capacity so completely that by May 1945, the Wehrmacht had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The German soldiers who feared British commandos emerging from darkness learned too late that American soldiers advancing in daylight with overwhelming support were equally unstoppable. The terror inspired by raiders and the systematic destruction delivered by conventional forces both contributed essentially to Allied victory. Today, when military historians analyze why Germany lost World War II, they identify multiple factors: Soviet manpower, American industrial capacity, British intelligence, and the combined Allied strategic bombing campaign. But underlying all these factors was German failure to accurately assess their enemies. They saw British commandos as terrorists rather than recognizing them as products of British strategic necessity. They saw American soldiers as amateurs rather than recognizing them as embodiments of industrial democracy. They allowed ideology to override intelligence, prejudice to trump analysis, and contempt to replace respect. The commandos who struck Saint-Nazaire, Vaagso, and countless other targets weren't superhumans. They were ordinary British soldiers given extraordinary training, motivated by justified fury, and employed with strategic wisdom. Their effectiveness came from combining tactical innovation with psychological understanding of how terror could multiply force. The American soldiers who stormed Omaha Beach, held Bastogne, and crossed the Rhine weren't warriors in the European feudal tradition. They were citizens of a democracy, motivated by belief in their cause, supported by unmatched logistics, and led by commanders who learned faster than any military in history. German fear of one and dismissal of the other both stemmed from failure to understand that warfare had evolved beyond European conventions. Industrial capacity mattered more than martial tradition. Democratic motivation proved stronger than authoritarian discipline. The nation that could mobilize entire societies for total war would defeat nations relying on professional military castes. The British commandos achieved their objective. They terrified German coastal defenders, forced massive resource diversion, and demonstrated that Britain remained dangerous despite military defeats. The American forces achieved their objective. They built overwhelming power, adapted to combat challenges, and systematically destroyed enemy capacity for resistance. Both contributions were essential. Both demonstrated that military effectiveness takes many forms. Both proved that underestimating enemies based on prejudice rather than capability guarantees strategic failure. The Wehrmacht officers who dismissed American troops while fearing British commandos learned through bitter experience that different types of forces can be equally lethal. The raiders emerging from darkness and the armies advancing with air support both represented threats that German military power couldn't overcome. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, the distinction between forces Germans had feared and forces they had dismissed had become irrelevant. Both had won. Both had proven their effectiveness beyond any doubt. Both had demonstrated that Nazi ideology's contempt for democratic societies was its own fatal weakness. The commandos who struck terror into German hearts and the conventional forces who crushed German armies stand together as proof that free societies, when threatened, can produce both elite warriors and citizen soldiers capable of defeating tyranny. The German failure to recognize this truth until too late stands as history's judgment on the cost of ideological blindness. In the end, it didn't matter whether Germans feared British Commandos more than American troops. Both forces contributed to the same outcome, total defeat of Nazi Germany and liberation of Europe from tyranny. The terror was real. The dismissal was foolish. The victory was complete. The legacy endures in modern special operations forces that still train in methods developed by British Commandos, in conventional forces that still employ combined arms tactics perfected by American armies, and in the understanding that underestimating enemies based on ideology rather than capability remains one of warfare's most dangerous mistakes. The Nazis who terrified Europe learned to fear British raiders emerging from darkness. They learned too late to respect American soldiers advancing in daylight. Both lessons came at the cost of complete military destruction. Both truths remain relevant today. Both stories deserve remembering as we study how ideology, innovation, and industrial capacity combine to determine the 20th century's greatest conflict.